Hi there, welcome back to the Rum Ration, where we sometimes delve into the obscure and absurd parts of military history. I'm Rejoy.
And I'm Colin. And today we're stirring the pot, or should I say the poutine, because we're talking about the time that Canada planned to invade the United States. Yeah, you heard that right. The land of maple syrup, hockey, and polite apologies to bank machines had a plan to march south. And maybe, just maybe, this episode has been inspired by some recent rivalry between our two great nations and some incredible hockey that we saw played out this week.
So first of all, I'd like to extend my hearty congratulations to Team Canada. That was quite a game. A well-fought, well-deserved win. That's the kind of hockey we all love to see, really.
It was pretty fast, man. It was incredible how fast that pace was the entire game.
Exactly. It really was. And what a great game. Just incredible in every way. And the second thing I've noticed is today, I see you are going hatless, whereas I've decided to cover up on top. But
I'm really growing it out. You can see.
I
haven't shaved in a couple of days, so yeah.
I'm looking forward to the ponytail. So
yeah, it's coming.
I know your feelings on that too. So that'll be really interesting. And I've got my editor behind me to keep me on track.
Excellent.
And so we thought we talked a little bit about, yes, this idea of the rivalry between our two nations and Canada invading the U.S. But before, our American friends, before you get kind of smug about all that, you had your own plans to come up north. You've done it a couple of times, went back home because the weather was bad. I understand.
Well,
but let's just say, do the words red ink mean anything to you? Well, we'll explore that today.
So pour yourself a tot of rum or maybe some sortilege like maple whiskey if you're feeling patriotic. And let's dive into Maple Mayhem when Canada planned to invade the United States of America.
Yeah. So let's set the scene. I mean, given all the political chit-chat and nonsense going back and forth across the border, a friend of mine, George Elliott Clark, former poet laureate of Canada, had actually suggested, there's been a lot of history between the two nations. Why don't you guys explore that a little bit? And we thought, that's a great idea. So we decided to sort of dive deeper into the relations between our two great nations, right? So let's rewind the clock a little bit, go back to post-World War I. I mean, Colin, you and I grew up, like many of us, in the era of just this wonderful friendship between the two countries. We couldn't even imagine a time where there was tension along the borders, right? But there was a time indeed, more often than not, there was tension across the borders. So right after the First World War, there was something simmering on the border. And then let's not forget, we were still a part of the British Empire at that time. So the Brits still had their interests in this part of the world, and the Americans didn't like that at all, did they?
No, they didn't. And I think it's important for listeners and everyone to understand that, of course, Canada only exists because of the perceived threat in the U.S. anyway. That's what really drove Confederation. And so enter in the 1920s, I think it was 1921, Defense Scheme Number 1, which was Canada's very own invasion plan. And it wasn't about conquering. It was a desperate hit-and-run strategy, which we'll explain. So kind of picture like that one dirty hockey player who throws a little nasty punch or an elbow and then skates away before the ref kind of notices. I won't badmouth anyone who plays for Boston because he did a really good job. And as a Montrealer, it pained me to agree with him when he came out talking about booing. But all right, Mr. Marchand, you're usually a rat, but you did really well for us on Team Canada. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. You got to agree with that. So I'm going to throw a name out at you. One of those classic colonial names. Major James Sutherland Buster Brown. What a name. Love that.
What a name.
So he crafted a plan, 1921. So the plan was, his logic went along the lines that if the war with the U.S. broke out, like you mentioned, Canada's best bet was to go on the offensive immediately and just give a couple of, hard punches, strike fast, throw a little bit of chaos into the American plans, and slow down the juggernaut while we wait for the Brits to come along and bail us out. In some ways, a little bit similar to some episodes of the War of 1812, right?
I mean,
in a little
I don't
way,
think any Canadian had any pretense that they were going to go down and conquer the United States. It was basically a delay, distract, and hope the Brits show up. Classic colonial strategy.
Classic colonial strategy. And also, let's face it, do we really want to take on all that debt? So, not really. So the plan, how Canada planned to invade. So this is really interesting. Canadian forces would cross into the U.S. across multiple points. It started with, say, Seattle, which would be invaded by British Columbia. And the idea was to occupy Seattle quickly in order to disrupt American supply lines on the Pacific coast, on the West Coast. Then you had Portland via the Okanagan Valley, where troops would push south to secure key transportation routes, which makes perfect sense, actually. Then, believe it or not, this is really interesting. I found this quite fascinating. Fargo, North Dakota, because it provided access to the central U.S. rail network. And I did not know that. That's a very important point. I would also think that the Canadian entertainment industry was involved in making that decision at the time, knowing that, a few decades later, it'd be the perfect setting for a blockbuster film. Always thinking ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Then you have the Great Lakes region into Minneapolis. Controlling this area would hinder U.S. troop movements. And of course, a bold move into Albany, New York to disrupt the Eastern Corridor.
Bold move. And they planned, as part of these bold moves, to blow up bridges, sabotage infrastructure, and then, here's a real kicker, retreat back into Canada. Kind of like, you'd appreciate this being a Torontonian there, Rejoy, like a raccoon raiding your trash and then disappearing into the night.
Very familiar with that. Very familiar indeed. Well, the idea was to disrupt American mobilization. So it's kind of like U.S. forces scrambling to defend Seattle while the Canadian troops are already at home, sipping on a cup of Tim Hortons, a mug of Tim Hortons.
Trying to look innocent.
Trying to look innocent. Interesting enough, though, it's also kind of similar in a very small way to, if you think about the Schlieffen Plan, where the German plan was to knock out the Western allies in 6 weeks, because they knew it would take the Russians 6 weeks to mobilize their entire force. So they'd have 6 weeks time to knock out the French and the Brits, then turn around, get the troops to the east, and then take on the Russians. Didn't quite work out that way, but there you are.
Didn't quite work out that way. But hey, a plan is always a start, right? And as the great military theoretician Murphy's Laws of Combat, no plan survives contact with the enemy, right?
No.
But I think it's important also, before anyone gets too smug or gets too wound up about things, we got to hold our horses here a little bit, because the U.S. wasn't exactly twiddling their thumbs at this time. If you want to think about War Plan Red, which was America's blueprint for invading Canada. So drafted around the same time, it was drafted in 1930, and it treated Canada as a key British ally that needed to be neutralized in the event of a conflict with the British Empire.
Indeed. And plan involved seizing key Canadian cities, Montreal, Quebec City, Halifax, and basically cutting off Canada's major ports and industrial centers. And interestingly enough, I mean, they seem to have a thing for Montreal, because during the Revolution, they came up to Montreal as well, didn't they?
They sure did. Montreal
was the weather.
Yeah.
That's right.
War Plan Red even called for occupying parts of Manitoba. Not sure they thought about that one so well. And Ontario, to control the Great Lakes and key transportation hubs.
And then, of course, the age-old naval tactic, blockade. They wanted to have a blockade to cut off British support. So the U.S. plan essentially was to strike quickly before Britain could mount a defense from across the sea, which makes sense.
I think it's also important that Rejoy's good buddy there, Colonel Buster Brown, his plan wasn't exactly endorsed 100% by Canadian officials. It was more of a unofficial contingency, fantasy gone wild, drawn up without any formal approval from the government. I mean, he had received the task to do it, or at least got approval, but afterwards, as we'll describe, the government distanced itself from it pretty quickly.
Much like many plans you and I have come up with in the subby's room years ago. In fact, when Brown presented his idea, he was met with a mixture of amusement and skepticism, which, yeah, I can totally see that. But he believed that aggressive action was the only way to forestall an American invasion. And what he was actually doing, though, although he's a loose cannon, he was actually following orders from the chief of the general staff, who was concerned about a potential American invasion. Why? Because after the First World War, America began to take over from Britain as the preeminent global power. And let's not forget, the First World War really put Britain into quite a bit of debt. They owed America $22 billion, close to $500 billion in today's value, if you can imagine that. So there was real concern that Canada could once again be a battleground for conflict between the two great powers.
Yeah, and that $500 billion is just me using a currency exchange on the Bank of Canada. It also tells you that, like, the value of what 22 billion would have bought at the time, it would be way more than just $500 billion. You're probably in the trillions nowadays. So yeah, the United States really had Europe, particularly the UK, by the short and curlies, I guess you could say, financially after World War I. So the plan that our good buddy Buster came up with, it remained a theoretical exercise until it was actually shelved quietly in 1928 when Brown retired. There were no shots fired, just a lot of maps, hypothetical battles, but he did make the effort to actually conduct a reconnaissance, a recce. Or maybe, I guess, if you think about it, if you're foreigner visiting another country, making notes, drafting a plan. That might be called spying. Another way. And he did that as part of a road trip he took through Vermont, that hotbed of strategic importance.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
It is.
he drove through Vermont, making observations in a notebook about how things like a large group of Vermont men were, quote, fat and lazy, but pleasant and congenial, hardly riveting strategic details. And there's nothing like a Vermont road trip to make you wish to have a refreshing drink. So let's dive into our We Wish We Had a Sponsor segment of the Rum Ration podcast. Today's episode of the Rum Ration is unofficially brought to you by Pusser's Rum, the spirit of the seas since 1655.
Whether you're drafting invasion plans or just drafting another round, Pusser's bold historic flavor reminds you that every great campaign, military or otherwise, deserves proper rations.
Pussers, because whether you're scheming to conquer new frontiers in Seattle or Vermont, or just conquering your thirst, a great plan starts with a great rum. Cheers, mateys. This stuff is gold. I can't believe they haven't reached out to us.
Still waiting.
I think our reach of 60 subscribers now on YouTube, you'd think that would just... I know Mr. Beast was a little nervous there in the NBA All-Star games. He said, you guys heard about the Rum Ration? Like, these guys are huge.
Yes. All it takes is one voice.
Speaking of absurdities, let's embrace the absurdity of all our cultural stereotypes. Imagine Canadian soldiers storming into Seattle, but politely stopping to ask for directions.
Or American GIs trying to invade during a snowstorm, realizing too late they shouldn't have packed their light jackets.
That's right. And what if these plans had been executed? Would Buffalo, New York be part of Canada? Would we finally have an NFL team?
Well, one thing's for sure. Hockey would be mandatory in all 11 provinces.
There we go. Yeah. Jokes aside, these plans highlight how military strategies are often shaped by what-if scenarios, even between allies. Defensive strategy isn't always about fighting the enemy you have. It's about preparing for the enemy you might have to face.
Oh, well said, Colin. Couldn't agree with you more. Exactly right. But thankfully, Canada and U.S., as countries realize, are better off as friends than enemies. Since then, we've stood shoulder to shoulder through various conflicts, Second World War, Korean War, Afghanistan, multiple peacekeeping missions where Canadian soldiers, American soldiers have supported and helped one another. Let's not forget the high number of Canadians who actually fought in Vietnam, which is something I think we'll be looking into in a future episode. But at the same time, let's not discount the real threat that was perceived by both countries many times during the course of the couple of last centuries, which led to having action plans devised to counter them, regardless if they were dismissed or not.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Rejoy. And all the teasing about Colonel Buster Brown's childish notes about chubby Vermonters. This was some deeply serious planning and deadly serious planning, because Colonel Brown's plan to conquer America, or at least disrupt it and wait for the Brits to come save us, it called for a lot of mayhem, destruction, and of course, that would lead to fatalities. It wasn't a joke. His plan called for 5 flying columns spread across the country, essentially conducting a hit-and-run raid on the key U.S. cities that Rejoy listed earlier. And each column would capture the cities, then destroy the crucial infrastructure and retreat back across the border before a large American force counterattack. It's not exactly part of the peaceful image that we like to think of ourselves at times. The hope was that by destroying bridges and ripping up the train tracks in Fargo and other areas, while we retreated back into Canada, the U.S. would be delayed enough that Britain and the rest of the empire could come and finish the job and hopefully not leave us twisting in the wind.
Yeah, exactly right, Colin. But let's be clear. The plan, Brown's plan, got mixed reviews among Canadian military leadership. And this is quite funny. His successor hated it so much he ordered all copies burned. So that tells you in what high regard he held that plan. But nonetheless, it remains the last public Canadian plan to invade the United States. And more importantly, it predates the American plan, War Plan Red, by about a decade. That's significant.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And War Plan Red itself was no joke. In February 1935, the United States spent $57 million, and that's 1.3 billion with a B today. So some serious money. They spent that to update their plan to invade Canada. They actually built 3 military airfields disguised as civilian airports near the border. And they staged the largest war game in U.S. history up to then, with nearly 37,000 soldiers drilling, marching, and probably dreaming of Tim Hortons. Ironically,
very congenial guys. Very congenial guys.
Of course. Ironically, War Plan Red was remarkably similar to Canada's Defence Scheme Number 1. because you'd have Detroit would seize Toronto while Albany and Vermont troops would march on Quebec City and Montreal. The same idea. Plus ça change, plus ça reste la même.
Exactly, that's right. And a
Good
lot
enough
of
for Benedict
imagination.
Arnold, good enough for them, right?
Yes, exactly. Well said. But remember, these are just contingency plans, and there was a very limited political appetite for invading each other. I mean, some things don't change. I think we can confidently, or hopefully, say it's the same today. Canadians and Americans are obviously much better off as friends. And let's just leave our fighting to the hockey rinks, like the Four Nations tournament, where,
Absolutely.
again, congratulations, Team Canada.
After all, from the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Kandahar, Canadian and American troops have fought together, not against each other, protecting shared values and common interests.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even though our histories include some of these wild what-if scenarios and moments, the present is built on partnership and mutual respect and friendship. Let's not forget that. And let's hope it continues as such.
That's right. So next time you cross the border, just remember, you're walking over what could have been a battlefield. But instead of trenches, we've got Tim Hortons, Chick-fil-A, and a strong cultural bond and friendship.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thanks for joining us on Rum Ration today. And if you enjoyed this dive into military what-ifs, please like and subscribe and share with a friend who needs to know that Canada was planning to conquer Seattle. Coffee would have tasted very different if that is
right. Cheers to history.
Cheers to history.